Is Japan's new Prime Minister really about to pick a fight with China over Taiwan, or is she drawing a hard red line to try to stop one? Barely 3 weeks into office, Japan's first female leader, Sanae Takaichi, has plunged Tokyo into one of its sharpest diplomatic clashes with Beijing in years. Her comments about the possibility of sending Japanese forces into a Taiwan conflict have triggered protests from China, alarm in parts of Japan's political establishment, and nervous questions across the region about where this escalation might lead. This script walks through who Takaichi is, what exactly she said about Taiwan, how China responded, and whether this is the start of a dangerous new phase in East Asia or a calculated attempt at deterrence. Sanae Takaichi has only just taken the top job. On 21 October 2025, Japan's parliament elected her as the country's first woman prime minister, ending the brief tenure of Shigeru Ishiba and marking a historic milestone in one of the world's most male-dominated political systems. Takaichi is no political novice. A longtime member of the Liberal Democratic Party LDP, she built her career as a staunch conservative, serving multiple times as Minister for Internal Affairs and Communications and later as Minister for Economic Security. She is widely seen as a protege of the late Shinzo Abe and a standard bearer for the Japan First school of hardline security politics. Her rise capped a turbulent period. The LDP lost ground, old coalitions frayed, and she had to assemble a fragile governing alliance with the right-leaning Japan Innovation Party to secure power. That left her with a thin parliamentary margin and a long to-do list: revive growth, manage inflation, shore up the US alliance, and handle an increasingly assertive China. Against that backdrop, any statement from a brand new prime minister carries extra weight, which is why her recent remarks about Taiwan landed like a thunderclap. The controversy began in Japan's parliament, the Diet, when an opposition lawmaker pressed Takaichi on the legal concept of a survival-threatening situation, a key phrase in Japan's 2015 security laws that allows the government to deploy its self-defense forces in collective self-defense if Japan's key survival is at stake. In response, Takaichi used a striking example, a hypothetical Chinese military move to seize control of Taiwan. She suggested that such a scenario could be treated as a survival-threatening case for Japan, potentially justifying the use of force. According to multiple reports, she told lawmakers that a Chinese attack using warships and other military assets to bring Taiwan completely under the control of Beijing could constitute the kind of emergency that allows Japan to act under its security laws. At the core of that answer sits one phrase that has become the focal point of the row. Takaichi indicated that a Chinese assault on Taiwan could be judged in the language of Japanese law as a survival-threatening situation. Sanae Takaichi, Prime Minister of Japan. That may sound like legal jargon, but it is anything but trivial. Under current legislation, declaring such a situation opens the door for Japan to exercise limited collective self-defense, meaning that under certain conditions, Japanese forces could support a close partner if an attack on that partner threatens Japan's own survival. The law was controversial when it passed in 2015 and has been interpreted cautiously ever since. Takaichi's comments push that boundary further than any previous prime minister has gone. In effect, she publicly linked Taiwan's fate to Japan's own security in a way that makes future neutrality hard to imagine if a crisis erupts in the Taiwan Strait. There are 3 reasons her words have caused such a stir. First, history. Japan ruled Taiwan as a colony from 1895 to 1945 and fought brutal wars across Asia. Beijing regularly accuses Tokyo of failing to fully repent for its wartime aggression. Any suggestion that Japanese troops might again operate near China's shores instantly touches historical nerves in Beijing. Chinese officials and state media have already invoked World War II in their criticism, warning that Japan must not repeat the mistakes of history. Second, the legal signal. Japanese governments have long tried to keep their Taiwan policy deliberately ambiguous, stressing the importance of peace and stability in the strait without spelling out what might trigger Japanese involvement. By explicitly naming a Chinese attack on Taiwan as a potential survival-threatening situation, Takaichi has effectively told Beijing that certain moves could bring Japanese forces into play. Analysts say that in the careful language of Japanese security policy, that is a major shift. Third, the timing. Takaichi made these comments just days after a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping and after a series of high-profile meetings with US President Donald Trump and other leaders at the APEC summit. Those meetings were pitched as efforts to stabilize relations. Instead, the Taiwan answer has reignited tensions almost immediately. For supporters, Takaichi is simply spelling out what many in Tokyo already believe, that a violent change to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait would directly endanger Japan, which sits just over 100 kilometers from Taiwan at its closest point and hosts key US bases that would be central to any conflict. For critics, she has opened a Pandora's box. Beijing's reaction was swift and fierce. At a regular press conference, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian condemned Takaichi's words, accusing her of hinting at armed intervention in what China calls its internal affairs. He said the comments grossly violate the One China principle. Lin Jian, spokesperson, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, Chinese state media amplified the criticism. Commentaries accused Takaichi of crossing a red line, and one widely cited analysis described her remarks as extremely malicious. Another official linked outlet, CGTN, went further, warning that Japan must rescind its position or face the fallout. A news segment summarized Beijing's stance with the warning that Japan must retract its Taiwan-related remarks or bear all consequences. Chinese Foreign Ministry's statement, in other words, China is treating Takaichi's words not as an abstract legal opinion, but as a hostile move that directly touches its core sovereignty claim. Even more incendiary was the reaction of a Chinese diplomat based in Japan. Shui Jian, China's consul general in Osaka, posted an aggressive message on social media responding to Takaichi's remarks. According to reports, he threatened to cut the dirty neck. Shui Jian, consul general of the People's Republic of China in Osaka. The post was later deleted, but by then it had been widely shared and condemned. US Ambassador to Japan George Glass publicly highlighted the threat, and Japanese politicians, from ruling party figures to opposition lawmakers, demanded that Tokyo consider expelling Xi. The episode injected a deeply personal tone into what had already been a tense diplomatic dispute. It also underscored a broader pattern of wolf warrior diplomacy from some Chinese envoys, a style that Beijing has at times tried to rein in. But that continues to flare up in moments of crisis. Japan's government has protested China's reaction while trying not to let the situation spiral out of control. Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara, speaking for the government, called the Consul General's message extremely inappropriate. Minoru Kihara, Chief Cabinet Secretary of Japan, and said Tokyo had lodged a strong complaint with Beijing. At the same time, he reaffirmed that Japan remains committed to its long-standing One China policy, even as it stresses that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait are vital to Japan's security and the wider international community. Takaichi herself has not fully backed away from her initial comments. Japanese media report that she has promised to be more cautious in how she phrases such issues, but she has not retracted the core idea that a Taiwan conflict could, under certain conditions, trigger Japan's right to collective self-defense. One analysis noted that she has refused to back down, pushing the line further than her predecessors, even while acknowledging the need to ease tensions. Behind the scenes, officials are trying to manage what has quickly become a multi-layered crisis, a legal debate at home about how far Japan's security laws can stretch, a diplomatic clash with its largest neighbor, and questions from allies about how Tokyo's new leadership will behave in a real emergency. In Taipei, the government has publicly welcomed Japan's concern over Taiwan's security and bristled at Beijing's effort to frame Tokyo's position as interference. In a statement responding to China's criticism of Takaichi, Taiwan's authorities pushed back against the idea that other countries must remain silent, arguing that stability in the Taiwan Strait is a global interest, not just an internal Chinese matter. They stress that deepening security discussions with Japan is legitimate, given the risks of a conflict spilling over into the wider region. The United States, Japan's key ally, has also taken notice. Washington has long urged its partners to think more seriously about a potential Taiwan contingency, and US officials have been signaling that they expect Japan to play a major role in any response. Reports say the US ambassador in Tokyo flagged the Chinese consul's threat as unacceptable and privately reassured Japanese officials that Washington takes such intimidation seriously. Takaichi's stance fits with her broader alignment with US strategic goals. In earlier meetings with President Donald Trump, she has embraced plans to deepen defense cooperation and boost joint investments in critical sectors and rare earths, linking economic security to military preparedness. That makes her Taiwan comments part of a larger story, Japan positioning itself as a more forward-leaning partner in a tightening US-led coalition around China. Inside Japan, reaction has been mixed and revealing. Conservative supporters see Takaichi as finally saying out loud what many security planners already assume, that Japan cannot sit on the sidelines if a war breaks out over Taiwan. They argue that vague language only invites miscalculation in Beijing. For this camp, Takaichi's willingness to speak of a potential SDF role is a sign of seriousness. But important voices in Japan's media and political establishment are worried. Editorials in outlets such as the Asahi Shimbun have warned that Takaichi's interpretation of a situation threatening Japan's survival appears to go beyond the cautious lines drawn by previous cabinets, and that openly tying Japan's military actions to a hypothetical Taiwan conflict risks locking Tokyo into escalation. Some opposition lawmakers accuse her of using Taiwan to cement her image as a tough leader at home, especially after a difficult election that left her coalition narrowly short of a majority in the lower house. With economic challenges still looming and her support base not fully consolidated, critics argue that picking a high-stakes fight with Beijing is a dangerous way to project strength. Even within the ruling LDP, there are quiet concerns. Japan depends heavily on China for trade, and major business groups are uncomfortable with prolonged confrontation that could invite informal boycotts or regulatory pressure from Beijing. At the same time, few mainstream politicians want to be seen as soft on China or indifferent to Taiwan's fate. That tension makes Takaichi's balancing act particularly tricky. So has Takaichi fundamentally shifted Japan's Taiwan policy or just made it more explicit? On paper, Japan still adheres to the same formal positions. It recognizes the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, maintains one China policy language, and treats Taiwan as an important partner but not a state. Officials in Tokyo are careful to repeat these formulas. What has changed is the tone and the thresholds Japan is willing to talk about in public. By floating the idea that a Chinese attack on Taiwan might be classified as a survival-threatening situation, Takaichi is signaling that Japan's red lines may lie closer to Taiwan than Beijing had assumed. The legal definition of such a situation matters. Under Japanese law, it refers to scenarios where an attack on a close partner or an external crisis creates an existential threat to Japan's security or the lives of its citizens. That definition is deliberately elastic, and successive governments have been extremely cautious about when they might invoke it. Takaichi has not issued a formal declaration or new doctrine. Instead, she has let a parliamentary answer do the work of shifting expectations. That may be strategic. She can reassure allies that Japan is serious about Taiwan without formally rewriting laws or treaties, while still being able to argue to domestic critics that She merely described existing rules. But in geopolitics, perceptions can matter as much as written policy. Beijing appears to be reading her words as a clear warning that Japan might side militarily with the United States and Taiwan in a conflict, something that Chinese planners have long feared, but that Japanese leaders rarely state openly. So back to the big question, is Japan's new prime minister picking a fight with China over Taiwan? From Beijing's perspective, the answer is close to yes. Chinese officials portray her comments as a deliberate provocation, a sign that Tokyo is abandoning post-war restraint and inserting itself more aggressively into what China defines as its own sovereignty dispute. That view is reinforced by Takaichi's reputation as a security hawk and by previous controversies over history, defense spending, and her admiration for earlier nationalist leaders. From Tokyo's vantage point, the story is different. Japan sees itself sandwiched between a rising China, an increasingly dangerous North Korea, and growing military competition around critical sea lanes. A conflict over Taiwan would almost certainly spill into Japanese waters and airspace and could disrupt the trade and energy flows that keep Japan's economy running. In that context, many officials argue that not talking about the possibility of collective self-defense would be irresponsible. Takaichi's team would argue that she is not seeking a fight but trying to prevent one by making Japan's position clearer. They might say if Beijing knows that attacking Taiwan could draw in not just the United States but also Japan, the deterrent effect is stronger. The risk is that both sides misread each other. Beijing may interpret Japan's new clarity as an aggressive shift that must be answered with more pressure, military drills, economic retaliation, or sharper rhetoric. Tokyo, in turn, may feel compelled to stand firm to avoid looking weak, especially under a prime minister whose political brand is toughness. That is how a single answer in Parliament can slowly evolve into a test of national resolve. Several signposts will show whether this episode cools down or escalates. Diplomatic discipline in Beijing. Does China quietly sideline figures like the consul general who threatened to cut the dirty neck, or does wolf warrior rhetoric become more common? That will tell us how much the central leadership wants to dial tension up or down. Takaichi's future language. If she continues to speak openly about Taiwan as a potential trigger for collective self-defense, that would signal a deliberate doctrinal shift. If her language becomes more cautious, it may mean domestic and international pushback is having an effect. Concrete military planning. Watch for any sign of Japan expanding joint exercises with the US around Taiwan scenarios, strengthening bases in Okinawa, or revising defense guidelines. Those moves would give substance to the legal language now being debated. Reactions in Taiwan and Southeast Asia. If regional governments welcome Japan's assertiveness as a counterbalance to China, that will embolden Takaichi. If they fear it is adding fuel to the fire, pressure for restraint could grow. For now, the reality is this. Japan's new prime minister has used her first weeks in power to draw a sharper line around Taiwan than any of her predecessors. China has answered with anger and threats. Taiwan has responded with cautious approval. The United States is watching with interest, seeing Tokyo inch closer to the role Washington has long hoped Japan would play. Whether this is the opening chapter of a looming confrontation or the noisy beginning of a new, more honest form of deterrence will depend on what all three capitals, Tokyo, Beijing and Washington, do next.